In April 1976, a plane crossed over northern Mexico at cruising altitude heading for Houston. On board was Howard Hughes. He was 70 years old. He had once broken the world airspeed record, produced some of Hollywood's most successful films, built one of the largest defense contractors in American history, and single-handedly transformed Las Vegas from a mob-run desert town into the entertainment capital of the world. When the plane landed, he was dead. The autopsy noted kidney failure as the official cause. What it also noted, in clinical language that the press took several days to fully process, was that his body weighed 90 pounds, that his arms contained broken hypodermic needle fragments buried under the skin, that he was severely malnourished and dehydrated, that the man who had once been one of the most powerful private citizens in America had died in conditions that, if found in an ordinary person, would have prompted a criminal investigation. No criminal investigation followed. The empire he left behind dissolved almost immediately. Because no will was ever ruled legitimate, the courts divided his estate among distant cousins he had never met. Most of what remained went to the Internal Revenue Service. The companies were sold, the casinos were sold, the aircraft division was sold. The name survived, attached to a medical institute that still exists today, but the man and the machine he had built were simply gone. This is the story of how that happened, and it is also the story of the people around him in those final years, who they were, what they wanted, and what the evidence suggests they may have done with access to a man who could no longer protect himself. Howard Hughes was born in Houston, Texas, on Christmas Eve 1905. His father had invented a drill bit that could cut through hard rock and had parlayed that invention into a fortune that, by the time Howard inherited it at 19, was substantial enough to give a young man with ambition essentially unlimited options. He chose all of them simultaneously. He went to Hollywood and produced films, including Hell's Angels, which he financed himself when no studio would match his vision for aerial combat sequences. He hired more than 100 pilots and several camera crews and shot the flying sequences over months until he had footage that no one had seen before. The film made money. Hughes moved on. He went into aviation not as a passenger, but as a designer and pilot. He founded Hughes Aircraft, hired engineers, and began building planes that broke records. In 1935, he set the world airspeed record at 352 miles per hour. In 1938, he flew around the world in 3 days, 19 hours, and 14 minutes, beating the previous record by 4 days. He landed in New York to a ticker tape parade. He was 32 years old, and he had already done more than most men accomplish in a lifetime. He bought Trans World Airlines. He bought RKO Pictures. He built Hughes Aircraft into one of the primary defense contractors supplying the United States military during the Second World War and the Cold War. He dated Katharine Hepburn, Ava Gardner, and a list of actresses long enough to fill a separate documentary. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, something began to go wrong. The plane crash changed everything. In July 1946, Hughes was test flying an XF-11 reconnaissance aircraft over Beverly Hills when the plane's right propeller went into reverse pitch. The aircraft went down into a residential neighborhood. Hughes survived, but barely. He suffered a crushed chest, a collapsed left lung, 9 broken ribs, a broken collarbone, a fractured skull, and third-degree burns across significant portions of his body. He was given morphine in the hospital, then more morphine, then codeine when the morphine was reduced. The pain was real, and the drugs addressed it. And by the time he left the hospital, the chemistry of what his body needed had shifted in ways that would not fully reveal themselves for years. The OCD had been there before the crash. People who knew him in the 1930s described quirks that, in retrospect, were clearly symptoms. The elaborate routines, the fear of contamination, the precise instructions he gave to staff about how objects were to be handled and placed. He had managed it while he was active, while the pace of his life outran the anxiety. After the crash, the managing became harder. By the early 1950s, the symptoms were accelerating. He screened films alone in private theatres, sometimes watching the same film dozens of times in a row. He began giving written instructions for tasks that he had previously handled in conversation, because conversation required physical proximity to other people, and physical proximity meant exposure to germs. The instructions became longer, more detailed, more elaborate. Staff who failed to follow them precisely were replaced. He was still running his empire from behind this increasingly thick wall of procedure. He was still making decisions, still acquiring companies, still generating the kind of business activity that produced billions of dollars in revenue. But the wall was getting thicker. In November 1966, Howard Hughes arrived in Las Vegas by private train. He had booked 2 floors of the Desert Inn for himself and his entourage. He was supposed to stay 10 days. He stayed 4 years. When the Desert Inn's management eventually asked him to leave because his presence was occupying rooms they needed for high-rolling gamblers, he responded by purchasing the hotel. Then he purchased the Sands, then the Castaways, the Landmark, the Frontier, the Silver Slipper. He bought a television station because he was annoyed by the late-night programming. He bought mining claims across Nevada because he was concerned about nuclear testing near his hotels. By the time he was done, Howard Hughes owned more of Las Vegas than any other individual had ever owned. He conducted all of this from the 9th floor of the Desert Inn, in a darkened suite with the curtains drawn, wearing nothing, watching films on a projection screen, eating almost nothing, and communicating with the outside world exclusively through written memos and a small group of personal aides who had been with him for years. This group was what people began calling the Mormon Mafia. The name was not entirely a joke. Bill Gay, who ran Hughes' Los Angeles office, and who had been with the organization since the late 1940s, was a Mormon. He had hired other Mormons for sensitive positions around Hughes because, as the logic went, Mormons did not drink, did not smoke, and were considered less susceptible to the kinds of temptations that might compromise their discretion. Over time, the inner circle around Hughes became predominantly Mormon, selected by Gay and loyal to Gay in ways that created a structure with Gay at the center rather than Hughes. Hughes preferred Mormon employees. He also, increasingly, had no idea what Gay was doing in his name. There is documented evidence, established in subsequent litigation, that Bill Gay was running subsidiary companies and making business decisions without Hughes's knowledge or authorization. A software company called Hughes Dynamics was founded by Gay using Hughes' resources and Hughes's name, without Hughes being told it existed. Decisions about the Las Vegas acquisitions that Hughes believed he was directing were, in some cases, being executed according to Gay's preferences rather than Hughes' instructions. The man who owned everything was slowly being managed by the people he employed to manage things for him. The detail about the plane crash that most biographies mention and then skip past is the specific nature of the injuries and what they required. Hughes was in the hospital for weeks. The pain management during that period involved doses of morphine that, by any clinical standard today, would be considered aggressive. When he was discharged, he was managing chronic pain from injuries that had not healed cleanly, and he was managing it with codeine, which he would continue to use, in increasing quantities, for the remaining 30 years of his life. The people who controlled his codeine supply in his final decade controlled Howard Hughes. That is not an exaggeration. It is the clinical reality of what opioid dependency does to a person's decision-making, to their ability to assess their own situation, to their capacity to override the instructions of the people immediately around them. Bill Gay understood this. The evidence suggests he had understood it for years before Hughes died. The relationship between Hughes and his aides in the final period was documented in detail by the people who were there. The aides worked in shifts around the clock, maintaining what they called the biological needs protocol. When Hughes ate, when he slept, when he received medication, when he was moved. The protocol was designed by Gay and executed by the aides Gay had hired and trained. Hughes, in his darkened room, received what the protocol allowed him to receive and nothing more. He sent memos, hundreds of them, in the final years. Instructions about business decisions, about personal preferences, about the particular way he wanted his water prepared, and the specific brand of tissues he required, and the precise distance at which aides were to stand when speaking to him. The memos were received, filed, and acted upon selectively. The ones that were acted upon were the ones that aligned with what Gay wanted to happen. The ones that were not acted upon were described to the outside world as evidence of Hughes' deteriorating mental state. He was confused, they would say. He was contradicting himself. The memo should be set aside until he clarified his intentions. It is worth noting that the memos themselves, read by people who were not Bill Gay's employees, do not read as the output of a man who had lost his mind. They read as the output of a man who was ill, and isolated, and increasingly aware that his instructions were not being followed, and increasingly unable to understand why. Now pay attention to this next part, because it is where the documented record and the pattern of events start to produce a picture that the official histories have never fully assembled in one place. Howard Hughes had been doing business with Richard Nixon since the 1950s. The relationship involved money moving in directions that neither man particularly wanted examined. In 1956, a loan of $205,000 went from a Hughes entity to Nixon's brother Donald, who was running a restaurant chain called Nixon's. The loan was never repaid. When Nixon ran for president in 1960 and lost to Kennedy, the loan became a campaign issue, and Robert Kennedy's Justice Department opened an investigation into the Hughes-Nixon financial relationship. Hughes also had a long-standing relationship with the CIA. His aircraft company was a primary defense contractor. His operations in Las Vegas had been used, with his knowledge and cooperation, as cover for CIA activities. His personal fixer, Robert Mayhew, had been a CIA contractor who had helped organize the agency's attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro using organized crime figures. The line between Hughes' empire and the American intelligence apparatus was not a line so much as a grey zone. In November 1970, while Hughes was living on the 9th floor of the Desert Inn, he was removed. He did not leave voluntarily. According to Robert Mayhew, who ran Hughes's day-to-day operations, and who was himself removed from the organization at the same time, Hughes was carried out of the building and put on a plane for the Bahamas while he was sedated. Mayhew, who had loyally served Hughes for more than a decade, arrived at his office to find the locks changed. His employment with the Hughes organization was terminated by Bill Gay, who took control of the operation. Mayhew later said, in testimony and in interviews, it was a coup. The question that nobody in the mainstream coverage of this period has ever satisfactorily answered is who benefited from removing Hughes from Las Vegas at that particular moment. Nixon was president. He was managing an increasingly complex relationship with Hughes, whose money had touched his campaigns and whose organizations had connections to intelligence operations that Nixon needed to remain invisible. The people who took over from Mayhew were more aligned with Gay's organizational structure, which was less connected to the old Mayhew CIA network. Then came Watergate. The Watergate break-in in June 1972 has a Hughes connection that most of the major histories mention briefly and then move past. One of the specific targets of the intelligence the Nixon team was trying to obtain was information held by Larry O'Brien, the Democratic National Committee chairman, who had previously worked as a consultant for Howard Hughes. Nixon was concerned about what O'Brien might know about the Hughes-Nixon financial relationship. The break-in was, at least in part, an attempt to get ahead of that. Howard Hunt, one of the CIA officers who organized the Watergate burglars, had previously worked at a public relations firm connected to Hughes. The man who gave Nixon the idea to target the Watergate Hotel worked for Hughes Dynamics. The threads connect in a way that is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented. It is just that the documentation is spread across congressional testimony and court records and investigative journalism from the 1970s that most people have never read. What it amounts to is this. The reason Nixon fell was partly the reason Hughes had fallen 2 years earlier. The network of money and intelligence and organizational control that had surrounded both men had become too complex to manage, and when it collapsed from the inside. Hughes never knew any of this. By 1972, he was in the Bahamas, then Nicaragua, then Canada, then London, then Acapulco. Moving from hotel penthouse to hotel penthouse, carried between locations by aides, barely eating, heavily medicated, disconnected from the empire that still operated in his name. The CIA connection deserves more than a footnote. Hughes Aircraft had been a primary defense contractor since the 1940s. By the 1960s, it was producing guidance systems, electronic sensors, and surveillance technology that sat at the center of the Cold War arms race. The company had clearances at the highest levels of the American intelligence apparatus. Its relationship with the CIA was not occasional or incidental, it was structural. Robert Mayhew, who ran Hughes's day-to-day operations from the late 1950s until his removal in 1970, had been a CIA contractor before joining Hughes. He had organized, on behalf of the CIA, a plan to assassinate Fidel Castro using organized crime contacts. He had managed the relationship between Hughes's organization and the agency with a fluency that came from having spent years on both sides of it. When Mayhew was removed in November 1970, the CIA lost its primary point of contact inside the Hughes empire. The organization that replaced Mayhew's structure, Gay's structure, was less connected to the agency and more focused on consolidating control over the Hughes business operations. The CIA's concern about this transition has never been fully documented because the agency's internal communications from this period remain classified. What is documented is the downstream effect. The Watergate operation, which involved Hughes money, Hughes-connected operatives, and a target who held information about the Hughes-Nixon financial relationship, went badly wrong in ways that ultimately destroyed the Nixon presidency. Whether the CIA was actively involved in the events of 1972, whether the Mormon Mafia's takeover of the Hughes empire had intelligence implications that someone decided needed to be managed through the Watergate operation, whether any of this was coordinated rather than merely connected, those questions have not been answered. They were asked in 1973 and 1974 by congressional investigators who ran into classification walls and witnesses who invoked their Fifth Amendment rights. The walls are still there. What is certain is that Howard Hughes, the man whose money and whose organization sat at the center of all of this, was lying in a hotel penthouse in the Bahamas when Watergate happened, receiving codeine from aides selected by Bill Gay, unable to attend congressional testimony, unavailable for interview, present in the legal record only through the memos his aides chose to produce on his behalf. He was the most convenient kind of witness, one who could not speak. The final years are documented in the testimonies of the aides who attended him, in the autopsy, and in the legal proceedings that followed his death. What they describe is a man who had once been one of the most capable and dynamic individuals of his generation, reduced to lying in a darkened room, his hair and fingernails uncut for months, his body consuming itself for lack of nutrition, dependent on codeine that his aides administered and controlled. He gave instructions sometimes, the memos continued, but the instructions were often confused, sometimes contradictory, and the people receiving them were now making decisions about which ones to act on and which ones to set aside. In early April 1976, the aides decided he needed medical attention. They had arguably waited longer to make that decision than the evidence of his condition warranted. He was placed on a plane in Acapulco bound for Houston. He died before it landed. The autopsy found broken needle fragments in his arms. The attending physician described his condition as consistent with prolonged neglect. Robert Mayhew, the man who had been removed from the operation 6 years earlier, was asked about what had happened to Hughes in those final years. His answer was careful and precise. He said, "If sheer neglect qualifies as a weapon, they killed him." He did not name names. He did not need to. The structure of who controlled access to Hughes in those years, who controlled his medication, who controlled his diet, who controlled the information that reached him and the instructions that left him, that structure was documented. It was Bill Gay's structure, the Mormon Mafia's structure, the organization that had been built to serve Hughes and had, at some point that is difficult to date precisely, become something that served itself. Howard Hughes left no valid will. Several documents appeared after his death claiming to be his will. The most famous was found in the lobby of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints headquarters in Salt Lake City, handwritten on yellow legal paper, purportedly directing that a portion of the estate go to a gas station owner in Nevada named Melvin Dummer, who claimed Hughes had once given him a ride in the desert. The will was eventually ruled a forgery. Dummer has maintained for 50 years that it was real. Because no will was validated, the estate went into probate. Hughes had no children. His distant cousins, people he had never met, and who had played no role in his business life, became the legal heirs to what remained. The legal proceedings lasted years. The attorneys generated fees measured in tens of millions of dollars. The IRS took what the attorneys left. The Hughes Aircraft Company was eventually sold to General Motors in 1985 for $5.5 billion. The casinos were sold. TWA had already been sold years earlier, after a legal battle that cost Hughes hundreds of millions of dollars. The various hotel and real estate holdings in Nevada were sold. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which he had funded with Hughes aircraft stock in 1953, survived. It is today one of the largest private medical research organizations in the United States, with an endowment of approximately $20 billion. It funds biological research across dozens of universities. It has produced Nobel Prize winners. It is what remains of Howard Hughes, a foundation he created partly for tax reasons that outlasted everything else he built, doing work he never specifically planned for and producing outcomes he never saw. Howard Hughes in 1938 stood on the steps of New York City Hall in ticker tape, 3 days and 19 hours after he had left it, having flown around the entire world. He was 32 years old. He was already a record-breaking aviator, a Hollywood producer, and one of the most famous men in America. He died 38 years later on a plane over northern Mexico, weighing 90 pounds with needle fragments in his arms, being carried to a hospital he never reached by people whose relationship to his interests had long since become complicated. The empire was gone within a decade. The name is on a medical building in Maryland. The men who controlled his final years were never charged with anything. The connection between his money and a presidential scandal that brought down the American government was never fully investigated. And the plane that carried him when he died was heading for Houston, the city where he'd been born 70 years earlier. He never arrived. There is one more detail about Howard Hughes that belongs in any honest account of his final years, and it is the detail that makes everything else harder to dismiss as merely the sad decline of a brilliant but troubled man. Howard Hughes, in 1966, was not yet the figure that the final years made him. He was eccentric, yes, his OCD was severe, but he was still conducting business. He was still acquiring casinos in Las Vegas with a strategic coherence that the financial press recognized and respected. He was still communicating through Maheu with the outside world in ways that produced real business outcomes. The deterioration that produced the 90-pound man on the plane to Houston happened over the 10 years between his arrival in Las Vegas and his death. Those were the 10 years during which Bill Gay and the Mormon Mafia had complete control of his physical environment. Correlation is not causation. But the question of whether a man who was eccentric and drug-dependent in 1966 needed to be as completely isolated and as severely malnourished as he was in 1976, that question was never seriously investigated by anyone with the legal authority to compel answers. Maheu's phrase deserves to be stated one more time, because it is the most precise language anyone who was inside the Hughes organization ever used about what happened. If sheer neglect qualifies as a weapon, they killed him. He said this, on the record. It was reported. It was not followed up. Howard Hughes had, over the course of his career, accumulated enough enemies, enough complicated relationships with enough powerful institutions, that the question of who benefited from his silence in his final decade does not have a simple answer. The CIA benefited. Nixon benefited, until he didn't. Gay benefited. The cousins who inherited the estate benefited. The attorneys who billed against it for years benefited. The man who built it all died alone, at altitude, over northern Mexico, heading home. He weighed 90 pounds. Nobody was ever charged with anything.